Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. My name is Gerard, and this is the program that asks, what if we took one of St. Paul's letters and changed the name on it, as if it was sent to America? Each week we talk about the two things people often say never to talk about at the same time, religion and politics. But rather than adopting the notion of separation of church and state and running with it to the point that faith should be made to disappear from the public sphere altogether, as some think makes sense, we instead call for a separation of all of us from a state with no church. This is not to say that governmental authorities or public organizations should be overtly tied to or guided by religious principles, but that the people in them should be. Each week we examine one such principle and ask, is it right? Is it true? Can we find connections to the other principles that are thought of to be right or true? Can we find more than one? And if so, should we look any differently at events around us? For those principles, we look to St. Paul. Today, we look at a writing of his on retribution, the seemingly natural inclination to seek revenge, and see if we can glean from it clues and insights into what has been called the apex of Christian perfections, reasons to believe in the goodness of loving one's enemies. Often, we experience a good feeling when we sacrifice something for someone else. But actions without something behind it have no meaning. To have purpose, a sacrifice needs not just a surrender of the body, but of the will. And it is so much more meaningful when, rather than starting from some neutral point and reaching up, we actually refuse the pull of an inclination that would take us lower, and then, even though it is hard, still then offer something up out of love. This then is what happens when there is an urge to seek revenge or retribution for something, and instead of going along with that inclination, we resist it, and then do something so much different. Such an event happened this past week in regard to the funeral of the former 31st President of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush. It is widely reported that he himself decided before he died that President Trump should be invited to his funeral. This is something that stands in contrast to another funeral of a prominent politician that occurred recently, a senator from Arizona. And with that particular senator, there was some bad feelings, some bad blood between the president and that senator. And the president was, it is reported, not invited to the funeral. In fact, at that funeral, people who are giving speeches and giving eulogies and so forth, took what were widely understood to be jabs of one sort or another at the president. So it was a moment of disunity rather than unity. With the Bush family, something else, something different happened. And for a moment of grace, for a moment, there was some grace that reached down into the relations between people in the political sphere in this country that often have been in some form of conflict with one another. And so we think that perhaps, we believe, I think pretty firmly, that the reason behind this particular action on the part of our former president was that he believed in Christian principles like those that are found in a letter from St. Paul to the Romans, in which he wrote, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be concerned for what is noble in the sight of all. If possible, on your part, live at peace with all. Beloved, do not look for revenge, but leave room for the wrath, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord. Rather, If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing so, you will heap burning coals upon his head. Do not be conquered by evil, but conquer evil with good. In that one short passage, there are a number of concepts. We will look to 5. 1, there are various references to what is good for all. 2nd, there's the concept of peace. 3rd, he explicitly discusses vengeance. 4th, he talks about burning coals, and we'll explore that a little bit as to what he possibly means by that. Then lastly, as in the last line of that reading, there's this concept of good and evil. So starting with the first one, this idea of what is good for all. Now that is something that is universally agreed, whether you're liberal, conservative, a capitalist, if you're a capitalist or a communist, wherever you are in the political spectrum, most people all agree, unless you believe in tyrants or despotic rule, that the concept of the common good is something that really there is no doubt about. And that concept of doing something that was good for all was behind this overture at the Bush funeral. I believe it was a eulogist at the funeral who may have even said either it was with regard to the funeral itself, or I think it was instead with regard to a letter that he left for Bill Clinton. This is another act that President Bush had done years before, which showed this same trait he had to overlook an urge for retribution and instead reach out to somebody else. It occurred right after the 1992 campaign. Now, the 1992 political campaign for president was, as most campaigns of that sort are, heated. There were jabs taken on both sides. It was something of a bitter loss. I mean, any loss is tough to take for someone who's involved in politics. But that one, perhaps as much or more than others, because the existing president, George Bush, was starting to rise in the polls just before the election was to be held. And then there was something that has been called the October surprise. There had been a special prosecutor who had been investigating the Iran-Contra affair for some years. What was controversial about that was this concept that perhaps arms were traded for hostages. And in June of that year, of 1992, the special prosecutor, Larry Walsh, had indicted the former Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, on 5 different counts, 4 of which were still pending the week before the election in November. And on the Wednesday before the election, the Clinton team and Clinton himself came out and started, for the first time in the election, really calling President Bush a liar. There was a marked contrast to the way they had talked about the president in the past. They all of a sudden made honesty and truthfulness a huge campaign issue. Then on Thursday, they drafted a press release about a new indictment of Secretary Weinberger. Now, we say Thursday because that was the date that was written onto a press release that actually was not given to the press until the next day. And on that next day, the reindictment of Mr. Weinberger was actually made public by the special prosecutor. It had not been made public the day before, the date that appeared on the press release drafted by the Clinton political team. And many people thought at the time, and it seems apparent for that and other reasons, that the presidential campaign, Mr. Clinton, knew about this pending indictment that was going to occur the next day, even though that was only a few days before the election, even though there was strong Department of Justice policy against releasing indictments or taking actions on the judicial front that could impact politics, could impact an election. Obviously, releasing an indictment like that, and the indictment was noteworthy because it mentioned a notation in the diary from Mr. Weinberger in which the name George Bush appeared. And it said that George Bush was at a meeting, a certain meeting, apparently at which some Iran-Contra affairs were discussed, and the political operatives were off and running with accusations that President Bush, contrary to what he had said before, contrary to all his denials, actually knew about some trade for arms for hostages prior to this, and that therefore he was lying, and so on and so forth. This particular indictment had a problem, though. This one count, this one indictment, this re-indictment. I mean, he was still under indictment at the time. They chose to indict him again, just days before the election. And the problem with this new indictment was with the statute of limitations. The legal principle that you have a certain period of time to charge somebody with a crime, and then after that, it's stale, and you can't bring it. Well, this re-indictment, this count, this criminal act that was that Mr. Weinberger was being accused of, had that problem. Still, the prosecutor brought it. In his memoirs, some years later, after this was all over, the special counsel mused about affecting the presidential election. He thought that, in fact, that he had. So, if you're President George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, and the surprise gets pulled on you, and then you end up losing the election a few days later, and there are many reasons to think that it was politically motivated, that there was not grounds for this re-indictment, particularly because, in fact, that indictment was thrown out shortly thereafter for precisely the reason that it violated the statute of limitations. So you could easily think that a dirty trick had been played on you. Still, when the time came for the new president, President Clinton, to enter into the White House, he found in the Oval Office a letter from George Bush, and it read, "Dear Bill, when I walked into this office just now, I felt the same sense of wonder and respect that I felt 4 years ago. I know you will feel that too. I wish you great happiness here. I never felt the loneliness some presidents have described. There will be very tough times, made even more difficult by criticism you may not think is fair. I'm not a very good one to give advice, but just don't let the critics discourage you or push you off course. You will be our president when you read this note. I wish you well. I wish your family well. Your success now is our country's success. I am rooting hard for you. Good luck, George." Now, why would someone write such a letter? Would someone in that position as President Bush maybe had felt some bitterness to his rival who had just defeated him? And still, he put aside those personal feelings and wrote the letter. And we might believe that for that same reason, he put aside his personal feelings for Mr. Trump and invited him to his funeral. Why would we say he put aside personal feelings to do that? There was a long history of animosity between the Bush family and President Trump. We can talk about that in a second, but the point is that President Bush did these things, both of these things, for the simple reason that they were good for the country. I think it was a eulogist at his funeral who, in talking of one of these two events, I don't recall particularly which, but I'm talking about one of these two events, he went to the president and said to him, well, why have you decided to do this? How did you manage to bring yourself to do this? And he said something that the questioner was not expecting. He said he had no choice. Now, of course you have a choice. He could have sought the way that so many other people seek, that is, to bite back, to criticize, to name call in return, to do something out of retribution or vengeance. But instead he didn't. He thought he had no choice. Why? Because it was good for the country. It was better to be united than disunited. And if he could extend an olive branch to either President Trump or President Clinton, at different times, that would be good for the country. And when St. Paul talks about, we should have our actions guided, but what we understand to be the good of all, we should have in mind the good of all. Surely you can say that about these actions of President Bush. And this action of inviting the president to his own funeral, when Trump appeared at the funeral, it was more than just good for the country. And we'll turn now to this concept, this strange reference that Paul makes in his letter where he talks about burning coals. He says, when you do something for your enemy, something kind for your enemy, something unexpected, then you will heap burning coals on his head. Now, it is often the case, and we might think that it's more proper to say, that if you do something kind for your enemy, you might, douse his head with water or do something cooling to cool the furor and the hate and the vindictiveness that is probably alive in that person's heart. But instead, St. Paul talks about burning coals. Why? Well, if you look to the Old Testament, there are references to burning coals, for example, in Ezekiel, where Ezekiel is passing on a word of God to the king of Tyre. And he says, with a cherub I placed you. I put you on the holy mountain of God, where you walked among fiery stones. And this is understood to mean that walking on fiery stones is akin to being in the presence of God. If you are near the divine presence himself, it is like walking on burning stones. Or it could mean, as it did in chapter 6 of Isaiah, something in terms of purification, that you purify one's heart. You'll make that person's heart more like the heart of God. Because Isaiah says, in describing a certain mystical spectacle that he beheld, he says, then one of the seraphim flew to me, holding an ember which he had taken with tongs from the altar. He touched my mouth with it. See, he said, now that this has touched your lips, your wickedness is removed, your sin is purged. So that is what perhaps St. Paul is talking about. In one way or another, we are purified, cleansed of sin, so that we can be in the presence of God, or we have this presence of God about us. This is what St. Paul is talking. You heap burning coals on his head. You bring the specter of the influence of God into this equation, where all that had operated before was vindictiveness and spite and feelings that are more appropriate as things that would be encouraged by the devil. So we can look at these two events from President Bush's life that we just mentioned and asked, did this happen? Paul says that if you do something kind for your enemy, you'll heap burning coals on their head. Did that happen here? Well, for example, just to go back and discuss this friction that existed between the Bush family and President Trump, it's easy to recall how during the election, the primaries of 2016, when now President Trump was battling against Jeb Bush in the Republican primaries, he repeatedly characterized Mr. Bush as being of low energy. He chastised him. He criticized him on a very personal level. He often referred to George W. Bush, 43rd president, as making a, quote, big fat mistake when it came to the Iraq war. He picked on something that was perhaps something of a sore spot for President Bush. But President Bush, who was regarded perhaps as being successful on a foreign policy front, somebody who'd kept us safe after 9/11, at least that's what his supporters happen to think, to take, this Iraq war that was, I suppose, the largest, foreign initiative that he undertook during his presidency, and declare that an abject failure. That, of course, is a very biting remark. He also, during the campaign, talked about having no more Bushes and quashing the Bush dynasty, as if the rivalry between Trump and the Bushes was quite personal. This produced understandable responses from the Bush family. Jeb Bush, at one point during the campaign, said he was sick and tired of Trump going after his family. George W. Bush criticized Trump for his, quote, casual cruelty, his nativism, his his belief that perhaps certain races or certain ethnicities are, better than others. George W. Bush criticized Trump perhaps where he thought was accurate, perhaps, but criticized him in a very dramatic way. Barbara Bush, the matriarch of the family, not known for getting publicly involved in squabbles or making herself known publicly, gave an interview where she called Trump terrible, and she called his actions with regard to Megyn Kelly, a certain famous exchange that they had on a debate forum. She called those actions by Trump terrible. She says that Trump often says insulting things and that she was sick of him. In a book by a presidential historian named Updegrove, George Bush Sr. was quoted as calling Trump a blowhard. So if Trump felt negatively towards the Bushes, they felt the same way back. But nevertheless, George Bush went ahead and insisted that Trump be invited to his funeral. Well, were there any burning coals in this? Is this suggestion that Paul's making to us something that we can in fact follow? Is it true that will it produce the effects that St. Paul says it will produce? Well, if we look at this situation, this relationship between the Bushes and the Trumps, we can note the following: that President Bush Sr. died on a Friday. The following day, there was a telephone call. President Trump called and spoke with Jeb Bush and George W. Bush. And Jeb said that Trump could not have been nicer. President Trump released a statement where he called Mr. Bush Sr., quote, wonderful and a very fine man. Gone, of course, now, even if it's only for a brief period of time, but gone were these barbs and criticisms, these jabs at the other person. You may think it's not such a big thing after someone dies for this to happen, but it does stand in contrast to another funeral from the senator from Arizona that had happened only a short while before, where even that didn't occur. Even that was was something beyond which the people involved could bring themselves to. So even if it's a short period of time, is it not still better to put aside personal feelings and at least act with civility towards each other? Well, this continued because on Monday, President Bush issued a tweet where he said he was looking forward to being with the Bush family. Now, you may think, well, that's just verbiage, that's just rhetoric. Maybe he's not sincere about that. On the other hand, perhaps he was. Perhaps he was looking forward to actually sitting down with some people that he had been at some loggerheads with. Does not everybody want to, on some level, to patch things up, to be liked by other people rather than be despised? So perhaps he was. Then on Monday, he also made an unexpected appearance at the Capitol Rotunda, where Bush's casket was lying in state. It was perhaps not necessary for him to do that, but he did. He extended some type of an olive branch in that action, paying respect. On Tuesday, he had an actual meeting with the Bush family, and by all accounts, it went well. And then on Wednesday, he attended the funeral. So immediately after this, there was this rapprochement between the Bushes and Trump. Now, again, maybe it's going to be short-lived. Maybe some of it wasn't necessarily all that sincere. On the other hand, maybe it was. And even if it is only for a short period of time, isn't there still value in that? Now, that's with regard to the funeral. We also mentioned that President Bush had sent a letter had left a letter for his political rival after the 1992 election. How about his relationship with the Clintons? Was that perhaps changed by this singular act of denying this urge for maybe some spitefulness or retribution? Well, after President Bush Sr. died, Clinton released a statement. And President Clinton said, he said, quote, I will forever be grateful for the friendship we formed. Will always hold our friendship as one of my life's greatest gifts. Now, you may think, well, all presidents will issue some type of a flowery statement after a prior, or another president's death. But the words that are chosen here, might be revealing. He says, I will forever be grateful. Forever be grateful. And I will always, always hold our friendship as one of my life's greatest gifts. I don't know about you, but when someone says one of my life's greatest gifts, that seems like more than just, the normal kind of jargon that somebody puts out. And it is known that President Bush and Clinton got along together in the years following. And true to President Bush's letter, President Clinton did, experience a lot of criticism, much of which I'm sure he felt was not justified. So it was a lonely job in the Oval Office at the top of the government of this country. And wouldn't it be nice to establish a friendship with somebody else who knew those same pressures and responsibilities? And that apparently was what happened. Perhaps years of friendship that perhaps just started with one letter, one overture, one willingness to go ahead and put aside personal feelings and reach out to another person. Now, it's interesting when we look at this event that happened this past week with this funeral for President Bush. We can easily be reminded of similar actions that were done by another president of this country, someone who's regarded as one of our greatest presidents, President Lincoln. He was known as being a very humble man. Before he finished his time in office, of course, finished it dramatically and tragically, but nevertheless, before he came into office, he was a political rival with an Edward Stanton. Mr. Stanton did not think much of President Lincoln. Often called him a guerrilla, nothing less than a guerrilla, perhaps poking fun not only at maybe some of the simplistic things that Mr. Lincoln said, his quaint stories and things of that nature, but also perhaps his facial appearance and looks. I mean, it was obviously a cruel remark, obviously said by somebody who isn't restraining himself in the least to go after perhaps some sensitive part of another person. But this wasn't a singular thing. He often referred to President Lincoln as a guerrilla. And he once said, if explorers want to go to Africa to find gorillas, they didn't need to do that. They only needed to go to Lincoln's home in Springfield, Illinois. But despite all of that, when President Lincoln was appointing a Secretary of Defense in 1862, he appointed Mr. Stanton. And somebody asked him, well, why would you do such a thing? And he said, because he was the best man for the job. Again, Lincoln, too, had this idea of the good for all in his vision. But beyond that, as a plus to that, something in addition to that, something took place. This overture, this act of goodness, this act of kindness, resulted in Mr. Stanton and Mr. Lincoln working together on perhaps a different plane, one not controlled solely by animosity. By the end of the war, they were in fact intimate friends. After President Lincoln was shot, Mr. Stanton was at his bedside and said, "There lies the greatest ruler of men the world has ever seen." Sound familiar? He used the word ever, just like President Clinton in regard to President Bush, their friendship was forever. He's going to be forever grateful. These actions touch people in a part that touch them in their heart, and it produces this inclination to use superlative words, trying to express the depth of the feeling that's been engendered. But like President Bush, this was not a solitary act for President Lincoln. Back in 1858, for example, he was in the running to be the Republican nominee for the senator from the state of Illinois. At that time, Senate nominations were made by members of the state legislature. And in the legislature, on the Republican side, Lincoln had 41 votes. His opponent at that time was Mr. Trumbull, and he had 5. And the leader of the Trumbull faction, however, refused to yield. Lincoln, even though he had a huge lead over the other person, Lincoln withdrew. Why? Well, he said it was for the good of the party. Again, this idea of doing something for the good of all. And when Mr. Trumbull got elected to be the senator from Illinois, there was an election victory party, and Mr. Lincoln attended. And he attended and greeted Mr. Trumbull, big smile, warm handshake. He didn't have to do that. Well, just 2 years later, in 1860, the leader of the Trump faction was again involved with the nomination process. This time it was nomination for the Republican nominee for president. And that particular person then stood up and nominated Mr. Lincoln. There was obviously the good of the country that was involved in this, but also there was there's an engendering of good feelings between people on a personal level. There is always, it's both that is involved in these actions. When people decide to do the hard thing and ignore the natural impulse towards retribution and instead do something out of love for an enemy, not only are there benefits for people in general, if these people are in the public sphere, but there are also benefits for the individual players, for people on a very personal level. There is both. And St. Paul's letter, he in fact talks about both. He doesn't just mention one. And this stands in contrast to other people who discuss the same issue. For example, there was an article in the trade journal called Psychology Today, which discussed this whole idea of vengeance and discussed the 5, biggest problems with it and the 5, best things you could do in response to it. And looking through the discussion of those 10 separate points, there's one thing that repeatedly comes out, which is that the focus is on one individual person, which is natural. Psychologists have a patient, and they think about things in terms of what's good for that patient. There was talk in this article about how it's corrosive, the hatred, the need for animosity, the need for vengeance. It corrodes an individual person. It eats at their own peace of mind, their character, and so on. And that, and then if they put that aside, why, then that person's psyche is improved. Their attitude towards life in general is improved. They feel happier with themselves. It's all a discussion about that one person. There is no discussion about, and perhaps it's not in the realm of psychology to think mostly about the effects of vengeance upon somebody else, the other person, or beyond that. A lot of people in general, acts of retribution are like, there are ripples from human actions of all sorts. There's good ripples and bad ripples, depending on if our actions are good or bad. Which brings us to another idea, something that's mentioned also. It's also referenced and alluded to in St. Paul's letter. He talks about this, the idea of good and evil, of defeating evil with good. And if you go back to the very beginning of the Bible, and you go back to Genesis, from the very beginning of human history as it's reported in the Bible, it's there. This is just part of the human condition. There is, in chapter 3 of the book of Genesis, Adam has already eaten of the apple, and he is speaking to God. And God asks him, "You have eaten then from the tree of which I had forbidden you to eat?" The man replied, "The woman whom you put here with me, she gave me the fruit from the tree, and so I ate it." So how hard would it have been for that person, for Adam, with Eve, the only other person that is there with him, when she hands him an apple? How hard would it have been if we were in that position? Could you say no and refuse that and choose to do the hard thing? It's the simple first case of temptation. The same temptation, the temptation against doing the hard thing, the pull of of our nature downward. That's the same thing that we can feel so pungently when we feel somebody has wronged us, and there's an urge to try to get back at them. So this is nothing new. It is nothing new at all, and it is, however, even though it's so hard to resist, it is, however, something that Christ himself also told him about. This letter from St. Paul is nothing more than a repetition of what he had learned from Christ, what we had all learned from Christ. It is, in fact, rather consistent with the Sermon on the Mount. After the Beatitudes, Jesus tells those that are gathered, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your heavenly Father. For he makes his sun rise on the bad and the good, and causes rain to fall on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what recompense will you have? Do not the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brothers only, what is unusual about that?" Now, the tax collectors at that time were notorious people, hated people. They not only collected the taxes due the civil authorities, but they were allowed, if they collected extra, to keep it. So they did. They would take from people, more than they could afford to give and use it for themselves. Hated people. But, Jesus is telling people, love your enemies. Love your enemies. Even tax collectors, love them too. According to the Navarre Biblical Commentary, the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount offered a completely new approach, quite at odds with the usual way that man evaluates things. They call it the distinguishing mark of the children of God, this concept of the children of God. What does it mean to be a child of God? Well, if God is love, as St. John tells us, to be a children of the one who is love, to be a child of that person, we would then need to share the attributes of that person. We need to commit acts of love. Then we can grow closer to God. We can actually be considered children of God. So this is all very, very consistent with what Christ himself happens to tell us. Well, there's one more item, one more topic, one more idea that St. Paul gives us, something else that he talks about, which is this idea of vengeance. And Paul advises us, as it is written elsewhere, Paul advises us to put aside vengeance, to leave that to the Lord, leave that to the last day. If we do not, then the last day applies to us. If we assume for ourselves the ability of God to judge and to requite acts of hostility, if we, assume for ourselves the ability to wreak some vengeance, then the person who wronged us, of course, will be judged himself on the last day, but we ourselves will also be judged on the last day. Quoting, in the Catechism, on this subject, there's a quote from Scripture where it says, on the last day, then will the conduct of each one and the secrets of heart be brought to light. And in Revelations it says, I saw the dead, the great and the lowly, standing before the throne, and scrolls were opened. Then another scroll was opened, the book of life. The dead were judged according to their deeds by what was written on the scrolls. When that takes place, and the name George Herbert Walker Bush comes up, one of the things that's going to be written in that scroll is going to be the letter he wrote to President Clinton. It's going to be the invitation he gave to President Trump to attend his funeral. These acts will be remembered, and so will acts of people who have not done something similar. We don't often think about, the last day, the final judgment, the time after we have died. But this is in fact a reality. This will happen. We will all be judged according to our actions. So the question is, do we have people in our lives for whom we are harboring some resentment? Do we know of somebody that isn't talking to another family member? There's lots of cases where people don't talk to other members of their own family for years because of some slight. There are stories that any funeral parlor director can tell us about when, even after a loved one has died, members of a family are taking, swipes at one another in petty ways. Do we have in our own heart any of these same instances? Do we have anyone for whom we're holding out any bit of resentment or any resistance to approaching them with some type of kindness? If we do, then it may in fact behoove us to recall the last day, the last judgment, to feel in fact the reality of God, to feel in fact, what He feels about us and how much He would yearn for us to be like Him, to be children of His, to act out of love. It is hard. It is really hard to resist, put aside, to deny ourselves an ability to seek some kind of vengeance on somebody else in a small way or a large way. But that's what makes it the apex of Christian perfection. It is what Christ Himself did on the cross. He forgave the people who had crucified Him, people who had caused Him so much excruciating pain. He forgave them at the time. And, perhaps for as much reason, well, not, as much, but, a large beneficial byproduct of that obviously is the example that gives to us. If He can do it, how is it that we cannot? How is it that we can't bring ourselves to do it? If it's hard, it's always said, good things, are often hard. If it's too easy, it's not as good. That's why it's the apex of Christian perfection. We put aside our own wills. We are told that we need to surrender our will to God. When it's most intense, perhaps one of the times when it's most intense, is when somebody has wronged us. And maybe they haven't. Maybe we're wrong. Maybe we think that they're wrong. and that they've wronged us, but maybe actually there's some rightness about what they did. Who are we to say? But if we think that, it's so hard to resist the temptation to go ahead and try to hit back at somebody. It's just a very strong kind of inclination. And yet, if we surrender that inclination, if we give it up, if we let go of it, we will be acting like children of God. We will be following the recommendations being given to us by St. Paul in his letter. We'll be, in fact, making ourselves closer to God, which is, in fact, what we're looking to do with all of these letters, with all of these recommendations to us by St. Paul. It's all about understanding God, getting closer to him, acting out his love. These are the lessons that we can hope to understand, and that's what we hope that we've shown a little bit in this program today. We thank you for listening, and we hope you will join us again for another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. Thank you, and God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.